Have you ever seen a hero ignored right in front of your eyes? Look at this fossil trying to act tough. One sneered, swiping the old man's service pin and knocking it to the ground. Walter Jennings, 90 years old, a Marine Corps veteran with more honor in his step than they had in their lives, stood there, silent, steady, humiliated. He bent down slowly, joints aching to pick up the metal he'd worn every day since 1945. And the world around him, it stood still. No one moved. No one spoke. But just minutes later, 50 motorcycles rolled in from every direction surrounding the station in a perfect deliberate circle. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because when you harm one of their own, they show up. Not with fists, but with silent steel and something even more terrifying to cowards, respect. Can you imagine the power of that moment? At exactly 5:30 every morning, the alarm clock on Walter Jennings' nightstand buzzed quietly, though he rarely needed it. His body, conditioned by decades of discipline, rose before the sound. 90 years old, and still he moved with a kind of careful precision that betrayed the soldier he once was and still was in spirit. Walter lived alone in a small white farmhouse on the outskirts of Mason Creek, Ohio. It wasn't much, just a single story with a front porch swing and creaky floorboards, but it was his sanctuary. He and Helen had bought it together in 1951, right after their wedding. She'd passed away 15 years ago, but her spirit still lingered in the way he arranged her favorite tea tins on the kitchen shelf or the fresh lilies he always placed near her photo by the window. His morning began like clockwork. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold wood floor biting his bare feet, and shuffled toward the kitchen in his wool slippers. The coffee pot was already prepped from the night before. Just one switch, and the familiar scent of dark roast began to fill the room. He liked it strong. No cream, no sugar, just the way he drank it during the war. As the brew dripped steadily into his old tin mug, he pulled on his faded brown trousers, flannel shirt, and the weathered leather jacket that still bore the faint emblem of the United States Marine Corps. The same jacket he had worn since 1945. Outside, nestled beneath a hand-sewn cover in the garage, waited his pride and joy, a 1945 Harley-Davidson WLA Army Green with chrome highlights. It was the exact model he had maintained and occasionally ridden during the war. Walter had spent years restoring it himself down to every bolt and cable. She wasn't just a motorcycle, she was memory, ritual, and therapy all in one. Once the coffee was poured and his boots were laced, Walter rolled open the garage door, revealing the cool gray light of another Ohio morning. Sometimes there was fog, sometimes frost. Today the air smelled of dew and early autumn leaves. He gently uncovered the bike, ran his hand across the tank, and whispered the same words he always did. "Let's ride, girl." The Harley kicked to life after 2 tries. The sound wasn't loud or aggressive. It was smooth, guttural, and oddly comforting. Walter strapped on his helmet, tucked the coffee thermos under the rear strap of his saddlebag, and pulled out of the driveway headed down County Road 12 toward town. The sun hadn't quite broken the horizon yet, and the road was mostly empty, except for the occasional farm truck or delivery van. 10 minutes later, Walter pulled into his usual spot at Franklin Fuel Stop Pump number 3. It was always available, almost as if the world understood it was his. He didn't just come for fuel. Every morning, without fail, he brought a thermos of hot coffee for the 2 morning clerks, Megan and Louise. They weren't family, but they greeted him like he was a beloved uncle. Walter would smile, offer the thermos with a soft "morning, kids," and share a story or two aloud. Most days, they listened wide-eyed, sipping his brew like it was sacred. To them, he was a legend. To him, it was just another day, another chance to keep a promise to himself to stay present, humble, and grateful for every mile he had left. Walter had just finished topping off the tank. The pump clicked as it shut off automatically, and he returned the nozzle with steady, practiced hands. The morning was cool, and a soft breeze rustled the American flag that hung beside the convenience store door. A few early commuters passed by without notice, but for Walter it was another peaceful start. Coffee delivered, bike running smooth, no complaints. Then came the sound. Not the low familiar rumble of his own Harley, but the sharp high-pitched whine of 4 sport bikes tearing down the street and swinging into the parking lot like they owned the pavement. Neon green, matte black, and fire red machines built to be loud, fast, and impossible to ignore. The riders cut their engines and yanked off their helmets, revealing cocky grins and youthful swagger. Leading the pack was Chase Donnelly. Though everyone in town knew him better by his self-appointed nickname, Razor, he had a sharp jawline, tattoos that screamed for attention, and a social media following that seemed to inflate his ego faster than his motorcycle ever could. At 25, Razor was all confidence and no compass. The four young men strolled toward Walter, their phones already out, one of them live-streaming to an audience hungry for anything outrageous. Razor's eyes landed on the vintage Harley like a lion spotting an old limping animal at the edge of the herd. Well, look what we got here, he smirked, pacing in a slow circle around the motorcycle. You steal this from a museum, old man? Walter didn't flinch. He continued wiping a small smear of oil from the tank with a cloth he kept tucked into his belt. Nope, just keeping her alive, he said calmly. Oh, he talks. One of Razor's buddies chimed in, laughing. Another leaned closer to Walter's back. Hey, check out this jacket. World War freaking II. What were you storming castles or something? Razor chuckled, circling closer, now pushing just enough to be felt. Seriously though, Grandpa, it's not Halloween. You look like a wax figure from a military exhibit. Walter turned and met Razor's eyes. Not angrily, not weakly, just steady and clear. If you've got something to say, son, say it with respect, he said evenly. That only made them laugh harder. Respect? Razor echoed mockingly. Tell you what, I'll respect the dead. Are you there yet, or do I have to wait a few minutes? And then it happened. Razor reached for the lapel of Walter's jacket, flicking it with mock interest. His fingers caught the small round World War II service pin that Walter had worn faithfully every day since 1945. It came loose and fell to the concrete with a soft metallic clink. For a brief second, everything stopped. Walter looked down at the pin on the ground as if it were a fallen brother. Slowly, carefully, he knelt, his joints protesting, but his pride unbroken, and picked it up. He didn't speak. He didn't look at them. He just brushed off the dirt, tucked it into his front pocket, and stood. Oops, Razor said, smirking. Didn't mean to break your toy, soldier badge. Walter turned away, heading inside the store to pay. The door jingled behind him as the laughter of the young men echoed across the lot. Inside, Megan, the morning clerk, had witnessed the entire exchange through the window. Her hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether to call someone, unsure if doing so would make it worse. She met Walter's eyes as he stepped to the counter. You okay, Mr. Jennings? She asked softly. Walter forced a smile, tight, practiced, the kind that hides bruises dignity can't show. Don't worry, sweetheart. Boys like that don't live long enough to understand the value of quiet. As he paid in cash, refusing the card reader, as always, the group outside continued their performance for the internet, posing, laughing, recording. Razor straddled his bike and shouted through the open door, Hey, Walter, want us to call the nursing home? Bet they're worried you wandered off? Walter didn't answer. He walked past them without looking. No rebuttal, no emotion, just silence. But in the air, something had shifted. Unseen, unspoken, as if the earth had quietly begun to turn toward justice. Inside the glass-paneled convenience store, Sandra Lopez gripped the edge of the counter tighter than she realized. Her knuckles were white. She was 22, working mornings to help her mom cover rent. And up until now, her worst shift involved a spilled coffee pot and a cranky trucker. But this was different. From her position behind the register, she had seen it all. All the push, the laughter, the pin hitting the pavement. Walter Jennings wasn't just a customer. He was a fixture of the morning. He brought her real coffee, told her stories she swore should be in books, and treated her like her voice mattered. Now the old man stood outside like a ghost from a forgotten time, mocked, surrounded, unprotected. Near the refrigerated section, an older man in jeans and a tan cowboy had shifted his weight. Earl Timmons, a retired plumber and a regular who rarely said more than 2 words, had watched everything unfold, too. His jaw clenched. His hand hovered over the door handle, but he didn't open it. Not yet. The silence inside the store was thick, uncomfortable, weighted with shame. No one knew what to say except for one man near the back. He hadn't moved much since entering, a tall figure in a faded olive green jacket with a high collar and no insignia, military cut. He had observed the entire confrontation standing still like a statue. Now quietly, he pulled a phone from his pocket. He didn't speak loudly, didn't draw attention. He just turned away from the others and made a call. 20 seconds, short, focused. Then he hung up and returned to watching Walter. Outside, the boys weren't done. One of Razor's crew, tall, wiry, always chewing gum, had wandered over to Walter's bike. He snickered as he popped open one of the saddlebags. "Yo, Razor, Grandpa's got treasure." He pulled out a weathered leather wallet and tucked inside was a thin metal tin. When he opened it, a black and white photograph slipped out and fluttered to the concrete. 5 young men stood in front of a World War II aircraft. Serious, proud, and frozen in time. Walter's unit. "Look at this ancient crap." The biker laughed, holding up the photo for his live stream. Bet none of them made it past Eisenhower. The laughter that followed wasn't just cruel. It was hollow, ignorant, and sharp. Sandra didn't know it yet, and neither did Razor and his friends. But outside, behind the smirks and live streams, behind the fear and silence, something had been set in motion, and it was already on its way. At first, it sounded like distant thunder, faint, rhythmic, almost easy to miss over the hum of gas pumps and the sound of Razor revving his neon green bike for the camera. Then it grew louder. The roar deepened, multiplied, and began to pulse through the pavement like a coming storm. Heads turned, first Sandra behind the counter, then Earl near the coffee machine. Even Razor paused, lowering his phone slightly, eyebrows knitting. From the east end of Maple Street, the first Harley appeared, matte black with a low-slung seat in chrome that glinted under the gray Ohio sky. Behind it came another, then 3 more riding side by side like soldiers in formation. And then they just kept coming. 5 bikes turned into 10. 10 into 20. Soon it wasn't just a line. It was a wave. Riders poured in from every direction, east, west, north. Some came in tight pairs, others solo. But every motorcycle had one thing in common: discipline. No showboating, no revving for attention, just purpose, unity, and the silent presence of people who had seen too much to be impressed by noise. They formed a circle, tight and deliberate, around the gas station, blocking every entrance and exit. By the time the last of them pulled in, the count had reached 50. 50 veterans, 50 machines, a wall of chrome, leather, and silence. Each rider wore some variation of the same patch on their back, a weathered American flag stitched beneath a steel eagle's head. Above it, the name Iron Honor Riders. They weren't just a motorcycle club. They were a brotherhood, men and women bound by more than road miles and biker bars. These were veterans, warriors. Some wore faded denim, others camo jackets or leather vests heavy with campaign ribbons and unit patches. Some were young, barely out of their 30s, faces firm with the weight of recent tours. Others were older, white-bearded, stiff in their movement, yet unflinching in posture. But all of them had the same look in their eyes, resolute, unwavering, and ready. No one spoke. Even Razor, for all his bravado, stood frozen. The smirk faded. The live stream ended. He looked around, confused, his earlier confidence leaking out like air from a tire. At the center of the formation, one rider dismounted. Tall, broad-shouldered, silver hair pulled into a low ponytail. He wore a dark vest with the Iron Honor patch surrounded by smaller ones: Fallujah, Kandahar, Kosovo. His boots hit the pavement with purpose. He walked directly toward Walter Jennings, who now stood by his Harley, his stance straight despite the pain in his knees. The old Marine's face was unreadable. "Walter Jennings," he said, voice firm and low, carrying through the still air like a command. "United States Marine Corps, Pacific Theater, Purple Heart, Iwo Jima survivor." Walter didn't respond right away. He simply studied the man's eyes that had clearly seen combat, loss, and brotherhood. "I'm Caleb Strong," the man continued, president of the Iron Honor Riders. Some of us served with your generation. Some of us were trained by your sons, but all of us owe you something we don't take lightly. Walter gave a small nod. I saw the live stream, Caleb said, now loud enough for everyone, especially Razor, to hear. We all did, and we just wanted to make one thing clear. He looked around slowly, gesturing at the silent circle of motorcycles and veterans. You don't stand alone. With that, the Iron Honor riders lifted their heads, not shouting, not clapping, just a sea of solemn nods. A few raised hands in salute. Most just stared forward with quiet intensity, standing like sentinels around one of their own. Walter's eyes misted for the first time in years. He didn't wipe them, didn't hide them, because on that gray Ohio morning, he wasn't just a 90-year-old man at a gas station. He was the reason 50 warriors had come. He was the reason silence had become louder than any insult. And for the first time since the war, Walter Jennings didn't feel invisible. The screech of tires signaled their return before anyone saw them. Razor and his crew rounded the corner, laughing loudly atop their sport bikes, still basking in the glow of their online audience. But as they pulled back into the Franklin fuel stop parking lot, the laughter died in their throats. They didn't even make it all the way in. The gas station now looked completely different. 50 motorcycles stood in a perfect perimeter around the property. Harleys, cruisers, some old enough to have seen war zones, others gleaming with modern discipline. Every rider stood beside their bike, arms crossed or at their sides, eyes fixed forward. It was a wall of silence, leather, steel, and stillness. Razor slowed his bike and came to an unsteady stop. The other three followed instinctively, forming up behind him. Gone were the cocky grins. Their youthful bravado melted under the weight of the eyes on them, eyes that had stared down real enemies in real battles in places far worse than this parking lot. No one said a word. The only sound was the ticking of engines cooling and the soft rustle of wind across the station's canopy. Sandra watched from inside, holding her breath. Earl Timmons stood just behind the door now, hat in hand. Alex Morales leaned against the counter, arms folded, gaze sharp and unblinking. Then from the far end of the circle, one rider stepped forward. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a limp that didn't affect the strength in his posture. His vest bore patches from both Vietnam and Desert Storm. In his gloved hand, he held a small wooden box. The man approached Walter and opened it. Inside, nestled against black velvet, was the World War II service pin Razor had knocked to the ground, now polished clean and gleaming under the pale morning light. The veteran turned and faced Razor directly. "You dropped this," he said. Razor looked at the box, then at Walter, then at the silent line of riders behind him. He didn't take the pin. He didn't say a word. He simply turned his bike around, his friends doing the same. No insults, no defense, just shame, and they rode away slowly, swallowed by the stillness they could never command. The morning air had stilled. The sun finally broke through the gray Ohio clouds, casting a soft glow across the gas station. Walter stood silently, surrounded by 50 veterans, a wall of loyalty that said everything words could not. The air buzzed with unspoken meaning, but no one dared break the stillness until a familiar figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was the young man in the olive jacket, Alex Morales. He approached slowly, holding something in both hands. It was a polished wooden box, small and simple, but handled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for medals or folded flags. He came to a full stop in front of Walter and opened the lid without saying a word. Inside, cushioned in black velvet, lay Walter's Marine Corps service pin, cleaned and shining as if it had just been issued. The tarnish had been wiped away, the scratches buffed, but its age remained. It was a badge that had seen war, survived decades, and now returned to its rightful place with honor. Walter looked down at it, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then Alex finally spoke. "Sir, your son asked me to give this to you," he said quietly. "Captain Luke Jennings, he's currently deployed with my unit. He told me what this pin meant to you and what you've meant to him." Walter looked up, his eyes misting for the second time that morning, not from pain, not from humiliation, but from something deeper, something rooted in pride. Alex continued, his voice steady. "He said to tell you this exactly. Tell my old man the Corps still makes him just as stubborn and just as loyal. And tell him I learned that from him." There was a pause as if the world waited for Walter's reply. The old Marine didn't blink. He didn't smile. He didn't crack. He simply reached forward, took the box with steady hands, and closed the lid with care. "Tell him," Walter said slowly, his voice low and firm, "his old man is proud." That was all. But those 5 words rippled through the gas station like a salute. Not a single veteran there missed their weight, because every one of them knew, some better than others, what it meant for a father to send a son into uniform, and for that son to stand taller because of the man who raised him. Walter turned toward his Harley, gently opened his saddlebag, and placed the box inside with the same care he might have given to a folded flag. Then he closed it, tugged his jacket straight, and looked up at the faces surrounding him. Brothers, sisters, fellow soldiers, writers, protectors. He didn't need to thank them. His presence, his endurance, in his history spoke louder than any gratitude could. In the quiet that followed, Alex took a step back, returned to his place near the pump, and watched as Walter stood tall beside the bike he had loved for a lifetime. There were no grand speeches, no applause, just a man and his story, and now a town that would never forget it. 2 mornings after the confrontation, before the sun had fully risen, something new appeared outside Franklin Fuel Stop. It was a small wooden sign, simple and hand-carved, placed beside the weathered bench near Pump 3, the same bench where Walter Jennings had quietly wiped dust from his photo just days earlier. The sign didn't have a plaque, no shiny brass, no mention of a name, just 7 words carefully burned into the wood, reserved for those who never ask for recognition. No one saw who put it there. Some folks guessed it was one of the Iron Honor riders. Others thought it might have been the station's owner, who had been oddly quiet since the incident. Sandra noticed it first when she opened the station just before 6 a.m. She didn't touch it, just stared at it for a moment, then went inside smiling to herself. From that morning on, the bench remained untouched, not because of fear, but because of something more enduring, respect. Everyone in town knew what had happened by now. People who didn't normally care about veterans or motorcycles or history had seen the viral photos, heard the story replayed on local radio, and watched security footage that had made its way to national news. But Walter, he stayed the same. Every morning at the exact same time, he still rode in. Same jacket, same steady pace, same coffee thermos tucked into his saddlebag. He still greeted Sandra and Luis with a soft smile and handed off the coffee without ceremony. And then after fueling up at Pump 3, he would walk over to that bench, sit down, and simply watch the sunrise. Sometimes he sat alone. Sometimes one of the veterans from that morning would pull up on their Harley and join him, not for conversation, just to sit beside a man who had quietly reminded the world what dignity looks like. And Razor's crew, they were never seen there again. Rumors said Razor moved his rides to the east side of town, somewhere quieter, somewhere no one knew his name. Others said he sold his bike altogether. No one could prove it. But what mattered was that the gas station, once just a place to refuel, had changed. Pump number 3 was never blocked, never dirty. Even on the busiest days when cars lined up at every pump, that spot remained open, clean, spotless, waiting, as if some unseen hand kept it ready just in case. Walter rolled in a few minutes late. People started calling it the captain's pump, quietly, without fanfare. Once a week, someone would leave something by the bench. A folded flag, a pair of dog tags, a single flower. Never a note, never a name. The message was always understood. Walter never said much about that morning. When asked, he'd simply shake his head and say, "Just a little misunderstanding that got sorted out." But those who had been there, Sandra, Earl, Alex, and every veteran who showed up that day, knew better. What happened at Franklin Fuel Stop didn't just silence a bully. It reminded a town, and maybe the country, that some traditions aren't old, they're sacred. What happened at Franklin Fuel Stop wasn't just a confrontation between age and arrogance. It was a moment that peeled back the layers of a culture that too often forgets to really look at the people around us. Walter Jennings wasn't just a veteran. He wasn't just an old man on a vintage motorcycle. He was a living piece of American history. A man who had served, sacrificed, and outlived most of the brothers he fought beside. Yet, in the eyes of 4 young men, all they saw was weakness, slowness, someone to mock, someone disposable. This story echoes real-life moments we've seen far too often. Viral videos of veterans being dismissed, insulted, or ignored. A Medal of Honor recipient denied a seat on a flight. An amputee vet turned away from a restaurant because of a service dog. A man wearing a uniform told he was pretending. In each of these cases, what hurt wasn't just the disrespect. It was the blindness. The refusal to see the human being behind the wrinkles, behind the scars, behind the silence. Walter stood for every veteran who never asked for recognition, but deserved it anyway. And what turned this story from tragedy into transformation wasn't violence. It wasn't revenge. It was brotherhood. 50 veterans showed up not to shout, not to shame, but to stand, to say with their presence alone, "You are not alone. We remember who you are." That is the power of respect. It's not loud. It's not performative. It's choosing to listen when someone speaks slowly. It's choosing to notice the man in the corner, the pin on his jacket, the story behind his silence. It's realizing that strength doesn't always wear a uniform anymore, but it never really takes it off either. And kindness, it's not weakness. In today's world, kindness, real, thoughtful, protective kindness, is rebellion. It's strength with restraint. It's courage without cruelty. May we all learn from Walter. May we all learn to look deeper, speak softer, stand taller, and may we never forget that respect isn't owed to the loudest voice in the room, but to those who earned it long before we arrived. So, what about you? Have you ever witnessed someone disrespected because of their age or background? Have you ever regretted not stepping in when it mattered? Type respect in the comments if this story moved you, or share your own story about a veteran, a parent, a neighbor, someone who taught you what real honor looks like. Thank you for spending time with this story from Valor Stories. If it meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that kindness is not weakness, it's strength remembered. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and always look twice. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore, but they still walk among us.